When I started training, jiu-jitsu was not yet enjoying the resurgence in popularity that it's had since the advent of ultimate fighting and mixed martial arts. Back then, if you told people you studied jiu-jitsu, they'd say, "Oh, is that like karate?" And they didn't really know the difference. Then gradually, with the rise of BJJ, you had people saying, "Oh, you train jiu-jitsu, Brazilian?" And if you said Japanese, they went, "Ugh." Right? And there was this widespread social expectation that somehow Brazilian jiu-jitsu was forged in the streets of Rio de Janeiro in back alley brawls and tested in the cage, and that somehow Japanese jiu-jitsu, with a 400-year history of blood and death on the battlefield, in real life and death battles, was somehow useless, ineffective, and inferior. And the reality is, guys, yes, there are some modern, terrible examples of Japanese jiu-jitsu that are bunk or too soft, and people look at that and say that would never work in training. But you need to realize that while jiu-jitsu is the unarmed combative method of the Japanese samurai, there was no one unifying style of jiu-jitsu. There were thousands of lineages, very, very closely guarded and closely protected. Even when I started my training in jiu-jitsu, everything I was taught was always kept very close to the chest, and you had to really earn every piece of knowledge. And the caveat was always to not share this widely and only share it at certain levels with people you had vetted. And to this day, I'm very closely guarded with the deepest aspects of the system. But that being said, these styles were, for the most part, quite effective. Obviously, otherwise they wouldn't have endured. Were there charlatan instructions in the 1600s that were forging their credentials, who didn't have much combative experience, who were selling fantasy? Absolutely. There has always been this. There will always be this. Were there people teaching, alternative woo-woo, no-touch psychic knockouts? And absolutely. And did this increase after World War II, when there was a kind of schism, a rift between the Japanese and the rest of the world, and they became more guarded, when jiu-jitsu was basically outlawed for public practice, and it was considered a banned system? Absolutely. You had this huge interest at the turn of the century with people looking in the early 1900s at Japanese jiu-jitsu, and if you look back at some of the archival evidence from that period, from like the 1890s to 1920s, it was some of the rawest, most brutal variations of jiu-jitsu you could find documented clearly. Earlier texts going back to the 1600s were sometimes quite guarded. You might have one finished pose illustration for a response to something, and you wouldn't know how to get there. One of my favorite was, there's an illustration in like 1620 of one guy mounted on another from behind with both arms tethered up and twisted, tied. The person's pinned with these pretzel locks that the illustration's labeled "defense against an attempted testicle grab." How did the guy get there? You're never going to know. That was more of a placeholder reminder if you had been deeply trained in the technique, but they weren't about to put it down on paper. In the early 1900s, we see some attempt to show it, and some of the old reels even show some really raw and rough kind of work. We see some propaganda footage around World War II of how messy some of the Kinjutsu and Kendo style training was, and it was much more akin to like samurai dog brothers stick fighting, where it didn't just end with the purity of the sword fight, but it invariably collided into a clinch, went to the ground, and went to short weapon. So there's evidence that work was there, as 100 years ago. But if you've trained in lineages where that knowledge was preserved, you know that was the way they were training much further back. And there is that brutal element that's oftentimes sanitized and hidden in katas or in flow combinations, and that effectiveness is there. It's very important to remember that at a time when people were walking around with meter-long razor blades intent on killing one another in duels or in war, that whether you had a spear and I had a sword, or we had any sort of deadly melee weapon, there was massive interest in maintaining distance and staying away. But the minute there was contact and collision, every interest in both parties was to close that distance and compress that range as tightly as possible. There was not this cinematic multi-block parry duel that you've often seen in modern films, especially in the West. Rather, it was a clash and a collision that oftentimes culminated, if not in a single hit and kill, a clinch, because neither person wanted to stay at that range, and that clinch with its momentum invariably had one person dominating the other, quickly taking them to the ground and finishing there. So battlefield jiu-jitsu in its armored form had many of the same takedowns and manipulations, but it was extremely brutal, extremely messy, and extremely rough. And if you've ever had the opportunity to spar in any sort of armor, even if it's protective gear or a weight vest, you know that getting taken down is clumsy and messy, but the principles of the takedown are still there. Now, jiu-jitsu has always spoken to me. I was always much more of a grabber and a mauler than I was just a distance striker. It always served me. I was very, very small and light when I started working in security and working the door, and jiu-jitsu worked for me. It consistently worked for me. And it grew with me as a style. Many of the deeper elements of health work and mobility, breath work, and meditation gained new meaning, and many of the deeper nuances that oftentimes I was maybe more ashamed of, or that I said, yeah, maybe this isn't as realistic, like small joint manipulation or things like this, became more important as I became more refined, became more probable when I gave them their correct place. One thing to remember, guys, is that oftentimes we look at martial arts and we want to have this romantic whitewash where we think, oh, everything back then they knew was so much more advanced than what we know now. But many of the beliefs back then in other domains were absolutely, since falsified and ridiculous. While traditional Japanese culture may have had some very advanced meditation beliefs and some very profound health understanding, they also had some very archaic mystical beliefs that have since been proven to be completely false. They may have had some incredible social concepts or some, enlightened ideals, but simultaneously they had some simply barbaric practices that we would never, ever, ever accept today. And combatively, it's the exact same thing. There was genius, there was extreme advancement in some elements of combative understanding, and there was absolutely some bunk which we need to strip away with our modern reasoning and our modern understanding.